In the first part, we became familiar with the background of the S-300P family and its radars. Now we will have focus on the other main elements and the combat potential. Finally, it is worth to mention the impact on the Ukraine war of the S-300P and S-400 systems. Based on the experience of the Vietnam War and the Middle East conflicts, it was a general requirement to increase the number of missiles ready to launch. Since the fire control radar provided 12 missiles and 6 target channels, it made sense to dramatically increase the number of missiles compared to any previous SAM system. If the number of missiles had not been increased, that would have left many target and missile channels unused and therefore wasted. The Dvina and Volkov systems had 6 launchers with 1 missile on each. The S-125 Neva had 4 launchers, depending on its type, with 2 or 4 missiles on each, which meant 8 or 16 missiles per missile battery. Even the S-200 site with 5 missile batteries had only 30 ready-to-launch missiles. Now, compared to these predecessors, a single S-300P missile battery had 12 launcher vehicles, each with 4 missiles. It had a total 48 missiles ready for launch. The firepower increased dramatically over any previous SAM system. An S-300PT missile battery had 4 launcher platoons, each with 1 air-free cabin, and 3 towed launchers. During operation, the guidance station could handle all the 4 platoons at the same time, but only 1 vehicle per platoon could perform missile operation and launch. The 3 launchers of the given platoon were connected to the air-free cabin by cable to the fire control radar, the RPN. For the S-300PS version, the air-free cabin was already integrated into the 5P-85S self-propelled launcher vehicle. The 5P-85D auxiliary launchers communicated with the RPN through this system. The design of the missile and their placement on the launcher was completely different from all previous Homeland air defense systems. The missiles were loaded in hermetically sealed containers instead of a conventional missile rails. The concept at the time was new and used only by the Strela-1 and the SA and the Strela-10 air defense systems, but they had far smaller and lighter missiles, and the containers were not airtight and filled with inert gas. Using such containers nowadays is considered widespread. The containers were stored in a horizontal position on the launcher vehicle. After stopping and deploying, the containers were set up to vertical position. It is not possible to open the hermetically sealed containers. The periodic inspections of the missile can be carried out using the external connections of the container. If the missile is defected, it is written off and scrapped. The containers are never opened for any kind of operation. The missile only leaves the container if it is launched. The missile was single-stage design, similar to the missile of the S-25 Berkut. A booster stage was not needed. Unlike the Berkut, the missile had solid propellant engine similar to the V-600 missile of the S-125 Neva system. This made operations with the missiles far easier, especially since the containers were hermetically sealed and filled with inert gas. Even the very first missile variant, the 5V-55K, had kinematic capabilities that far surpassed the missiles of the Volkov and Neva systems, despite the fact that the Neva's V-601 missile weighed around 650 kg and the 5V-55K was only about 50% heavier, 1418 kg. It was even lighter than the various missile variants of the Volkov system, which had a launch weight of approximately 2400 kg for the two-stage missile. The length of the new missile was 7.25 meters, which made it about 3.5 meters shorter than the V-7055 missiles of the Volkov, including the booster stage. The diameter of the missile was 508 mm, which is almost identical to the V-7055 missile size. The use of solid propellant and the storage container significantly simplified the operation of the missile. These factors also had a positive impact on the missile's lifespan and weather resistance. At launch, the missile is ejected from its vertically positioned container by a gas catapult, throwing up to 20 meters into the air. The polyurethane lid of the container is burst open by the overpressure generated by the gas generator that powers the ejection catapult in front of the missile's nose. Approximately 1 second after the ejection, the thrust vectoring rocket engine ignites, with its operating for about 8 to 10 seconds, depending on the atmospheric temperature. Thanks to the thrust vectoring, the missile is immediately turned towards the calculated quasi-ballistic trajectory. The engine accelerates the missile to a burnout speed of approximately 2000 meters per second, depending on the flight path, which exceeds Mach 6. Another new feature of the S-300P family is the trajectory that the missile is approaching the target on. In the case of the Volkov and Neva systems, the missile had to fly along almost on a straight line to the calculated interception point. Thanks to this, the dominant proportion of its entire trajectory was in the dense atmosphere, which meant huge drag. For the S-200, a combined solution with autopilot was used, besides the proportional guidance of the semi-active radar homing. Against targets at high altitudes and distances, the missile could approach the target at altitudes of more than 20 kilometers. The quasi-ballistic trajectory was used first to the S-300 system. This essentially means that the missile flies on a trajectory similar to a ballistic missile, but with a compressed peak altitude, where the maximum altitude of the trajectory is limited based on the target parameters. Against a near and low altitude target, the trajectory has lower peak altitude. For a high altitude and long range target, the apogee is limited to 27,000 meters. Thanks to this, the missile can rely on control surfaces for the 3-axis control during all phases of the flight. Of course, as the altitude increases, the maneuverability of the missile decreases due to the decreasing air density and because of the deceleration of the missile. The shape of the missile also corresponds to the quasi-ballistic trajectory. It is far more similar to a Scud ballistic missile than to any previous surface-to-air missile. On the image, next to the 5V-55R missile of the S-300 system is a Scud-D ballistic missile. They are almost like twins. The advantage of the quasi-ballistic trajectory was that it allowed for a much more optimal energy management. Even against a target 20 meters above the ground, with 25 km distance, at the time of interception, the missile climbed to an altitude about 3000 meters to reduce the drag. As the target altitude and distance increased, so did the altitude of the trajectory peak. The missile quickly climbs above the dense layers of atmosphere. Thanks to this, it maintained its high speed relatively well against medium and high-flying targets. This quasi-ballistic trajectory was made possible by the Phase Array Fire Control Radar, the RPN, which enabled it to track multiple targets and missiles, unlike the Volkov and Neva systems, where the missile and target had to be within the narrow May beams of the fire control radar. Despite the ballistic nature of the trajectory, the missile makes continuous course corrections based on the maneuvers and speed of the target. So if the target changes course after the launch, the missile will not only maneuver in terminal phase, but all the way through the trajectory. However, the ballistic nature of the trajectory still remains true. The first missile variant, the 5V-55K, used purely radio command guidance, like the good old analog S-25 Berkut, S-75 Volkov, and S-125 Neva SAMs. The principle of the guidance restricted the engagement zone. As the range increases, so does the radar's measurement error, so beyond a certain distance, the system cannot guide the missile with high probability close enough to the target. Just considering the total kinetic energy, the 5V-55K missile could fly much further than the maximum engagement distance of the system. In contrast with the three previously mentioned SAM systems, their maximum engagement range and the edge of the engagement zone were limited by the kinetic energy of the missiles, not by the guidance. The 5V-55K missile was created with a view that the S-300 family will be developed further. The large kinematic range could be utilized with a more advanced, with English terminology TVM, track via missile guidance, which was explained in the first episode. The high speed of the missile was also important from the point of view that the missile far more quickly reached the edge of the low-level engagement zone compared to the previous SAMs. Even against a terrain-following target with 25 km flyby distance, the missile could hit the target before it disappeared under the radar horizon. Moreover, the missile was so fast that it was possible to launch twice against the relatively slow terrain-following cruise missiles with a relatively large flyby distance. The high speed was not only important in terms of range, but also reduced the so-called cycle time of the system. One of the most positive effects of the solid propellant was that it enabled the dramatic cost reduction of the missile. The missiles of Berkut, Volkhov and Vega, which use liquid fuel and oxidizer, the turbo pump and its control and all associated components made them very expensive. The impact on price of the solid fuel is clearly visible even just comparing the missile of the S-125 system to any previous SAMs. The cost of the solid propellant V-601P missile was only 10% of the V-750 of the Dvina and only 7% of the V-755 missile of the Volkhov. The new 5A-55K missile was not so cheap, but the 60,000 rubles price was still only a third or quarter of the cost of the V-750 or 755 missile. The price of the 5V-55R missile was 50% higher, thanks to the TVM guidance capability, but the 90,000 rubles cost per unit was still far below the level of the earlier Berkut, Dvina and Volkhov, costing about half to a third of these. The mildest term what can be used for these new missiles is that they represented a new generation compared to any previous missile. The warhead of the 5A-55K missile weighed 130 kg, which was significantly lighter than the 196 kg warhead of the V-755 missile or the 270 kg warhead of the Vega's V-880 missile. However, it was heavier than the 72 kg warhead used on NAVA's V-601P missiles. The 5V-55S missile variant had the so-called special warhead, which is just a nice terminology denoting a nuclear warhead. Missile containers can be reloaded and removed from the launcher in pairs, but in case of need, a single container also can be removed or reloaded. The containers are transported to the launchers with the TM missile transporter and reloader. Two containers are stored on a single pallet, two pallets are placed on each other. If the pallets are on the ground, three can be stacked on top of each other. The ZM reloader vehicle lifts one or two containers with the two independent lifting mechanisms from a pallet and places it on a launch vehicle or removes empty containers. Due to the design of the launcher, one pair of the containers can only be placed from the left and the other pair from the right side. The missile containers are stored in the open air as shown in the picture. Interestingly, there was no specific expectation for this area to be radically better than previous SAM systems. However, because of the large number of missiles available at a single missile battery, the reloading of launch vehicles was treated in a less time-critical manner compared to previous SAM systems. In the short clip, the ZM lifts the containers from the TM missile transporter. The person performing the reload controls the crane with a remote control device connected via cable. The new missile represented a completely different kind of threat from any before it. For the earlier systems like the Volkov and Neva, the radar warning receiver could provide the direction to the pilot to look to see the incoming missile. The missile essentially flew following almost a straight line between the target and the launcher. Moreover, the missile produced very thin, well-visible smoke trails. Since the rocket engine of the 5V-55 missile had only about 8 to 10 seconds burnout time, the missile essentially cannot be detected visually. Compared to about Mach 2 speed of the Volkov's and Neva's missile, the 5V-55K could have Mach 3 or even Mach 4 speed in its terminal phase. In such conditions, it was virtually impossible to perform a planned and well-executed evasion maneuvers against it because it was impossible to detect such a small and high-speed object with naked eye. In short, the 5V-55K missile of the S-300 combined all the advantages of the missiles of the S-25 Berkut and S-125 Neva system. It had a single stage but a solid propellant rocket engine. Moreover, the new system managed to get rid of the disadvantages of the missiles of the Volkov, Neva and Vega systems, except the pure radio command guidance method, which was restricted the maximum engagement range. Initially, only one issue was not solved: the overheating of the missile due to the high speed. This was remedied by the appearance of the quartz ceramic nose cone, which had been presented in the video about the S-200 SAM system. Until this upgrade, the guaranteed engagement zone did not reach the radar horizon at longer range, as we can see later. The size, the kinematic characteristics, the mode of storage and the handling of the missile were undeniably a generational leap, and its maneuverability exceeded all the previous missiles of any PVO system. In addition to its high speed, the missile was capable of 13 to 18 G overload turn at the altitude of a typical tactical fighter or strike fighter. The pure radio command guidance has been replaced by the TU-2 with the track via missile method for the 5V-55R missile. The principle of its guidance had been explained in the first episode. This extended the engagement zone of the system, and the kinetic energy of the missile was still not the limiting factor to the maximum range. The 5V-55R missile had the same warhead as the 5V-55K, but its weight increased to 1,665 kg thanks to the new equipment required for the TVM guidance. When the S-300PS version appeared in the second half of the 80s, the previous S-300PT missile batteries were upgraded to S-300PT-1A version, so they could use also the new 5V-55R missile. The S-300PS is downward compatible, so it can also use the 5V-55K and 5V-55S and the new 5V-55R missile from the beginning. Of course, the maximum engagement range was smaller with the older 5V-55K missile. Production of the 5V-55 missile family ended after the manufacturing the last S-300P MU missile battery, which is the export variant of the PS. As the missiles aged and became obsolete, the 48N6 missile for the later S-300P M1 variant also became usable for the previous S-300P variants. But the maximum engagement range in that case was only 90 km, not 150 km, but the PM1 is capable of otherwise. The detection and tracking range of the RPM fire control radar restricted the engagement zone of the S-300PS, even with the more advanced missile. The S-300PS version was far more mobile than the previous S-75 and S-125 families, not mentioned compared to the completely static S-25 Berkut and S-200 SAM systems. However, it should be noted that better mobility can only be interpreted with certain limitations. At first step, let's see the commanding unit in the equation. The fire control radar of the S-300PS is deployed and ready in 5 minutes after initiating the process. This is very fast, but it still means that if the commanding unit relocates, during the relocation the entire S-300PS regiment or brigade loses the medium-high altitude target acquisition radar, the Big Bird. The medium-high altitude situational awareness of the S-300P regiment or brigade is missing. The high mobility of the missile batteries rather means quick relocation capability in the vicinity of the commanding unit if the regiment or brigade does not wish to temporarily lose the Big Bird radar for a short period. However, it is at least true that the command unit can move on road and relocates in relatively modest extent, moves only 20 km away, then the commanding unit can redeploy at a new location within 30 minutes. This is far above the level of previous PVOSM systems. It doesn't matter if the SA-2 and SA-3 families had their own target acquisition radar, as the deployment and relocation time was on the 2-hour scale. What about the missile battery? The PS version has self-propelled missile launchers and fire control radar. The RPN now has 5 minutes readiness time. The issue is the low altitude target acquisition radar, the NVO, the clamshell radar. Deploying the 25-meter high 40V6M mast takes 60 minutes, and the 39-meter high mast with the 40V6MD extension needs 120 minutes to be ready. So even if the entire regiment or brigade relocates, then stops, they became combat ready in 5 minutes, but limited low-level target acquisition capability until the NVO is not ready. The RLO would have provided a situational awareness against medium and high-altitude targets. Besides the RLO radar, only limited low-level target search was possible with the RPN. The RPN can perform sector search in a 1 by 105 degree size airspace. However, since the RPN is not installed on a mast, its detection range depending on the atmospheric conditions. The detection range is about 30-35 km against terrain-following targets. If the main direction of the threats is well defined, then the target search time of the RPN makes it suitable for low-altitude target search, but this is considerably slower compared to the NVO. While the NVO performs 2 complete 360-degree rotations, the RPN only does a single scan of the 1 by 105 degree zone. If the RLO is not available because of any reasons, the combat capability of the S-300P regiment or brigade is only a fraction of its nominal. Therefore, the missile batteries can only move so far away from the commanding unit that the commanding unit should be protected against at least low-altitude threats, since the commanding unit itself is completely defenseless. The commanding unit practically relocates under the protective umbrella of an active S-300PS missile battery, whose NVO radar provides protection against low-altitude targets in its vicinity. Now all the main elements of the S-300P system had been presented, so let's see its engagement zone and combat potential, which can be derived from the previously mentioned features. In first step, here is the engagement zone with 0 flyby distance to see the difference between the 555K and the 5V55R missile. The red area shows the zone with the pure radio command guided. The combined red and green zones cover the zone of the TVM guided later missile type. The maximum range for the first missile was only 47 km, for the later's 75 km. When the S-300PT was fielded, the friction heat issue, which was mentioned for the S-200 Vega system, had not been solved. For this reason, the S-300PT at the end of the 70s could reliably engage terrain-following targets only up to 22 km of distance. This was adequate against terrain-following cruise missiles, but it could limit the number of missile launches because the targets could not be engaged at the radar horizon. Because of the overheating against medium-high altitude targets, the guaranteed engagement zone was restricted, the kinematic range of the missile could not be fully utilized. Targets at 40 km of distance at 5000 meter altitude could not be reliably engaged with the 555K and the early 5V55R missiles. Even the bombers attacking with bombs at 10,000 meters of altitude were outside the guaranteed engagement zone above 55 km of distance. This was not a problem for defense of Moscow in 1978, where such targets did not have to anticipate it in the late 70s. Even the high-speed AGM-25 Hound Dog missile could have been downed when it used the high-altitude attack profile flying at 17,000 meters of altitude with Mach 2 speed. However, this factor became irrelevant because the US retired the AGM-29 in 1976, 2 years before the deployment of the first S-300P missile battery. Fighter jets were not expected as targets in the vicinity of Moscow because they would not have been able to fly that deep into the Soviet Union. On the other hand, in case of the export of the S-300P system, as well as some major cities and military bases in the Soviet Union, were within range to the Western fighter-sized targets. For example, Vladivostok was within range from Japan or South Korea. Fighter jets in most cases never fly higher than 8 or 10,000 meters of altitude in the combat zone. Against tactical aircraft, these systems has restricted engagement zones with the 5V-55K and the early 5V-55R missiles. However, it has to be noted on the margin that just because the guaranteed engagement zone did not reach the radar horizon, it did not mean that the S-300 could not engage targets outside of that. It meant only that the reliability of the missile at a given altitude and distance was no longer guaranteed. In cold weather, the heating problem likely was less serious. After these, let's see the whole engagement zone of the S-300PT-1A, PS and the export PMU variants. The appearance of the quartz ceramic nose in the second half of the 1980s made possibly extending the engagement zone. Based on a German book about the S-300 PMU, the export variant was offered with such an engagement zone that reached the radar horizon against terrain-following targets. The S-300P was able to engage both incoming and receding targets. The maximum engagement target speed against incoming targets was 1200 meters per second, about Mach 4. This is the same what the S-200E Vega had. The maximum speed of a receding target was 500 meters per second. The minimum altitude of the engagement zone was 25 meters, between a distance of 5 and 38 kilometers. Then the guaranteed minimum engagement altitude increases with distance, which is 3000 meters of at an altitude at a distance of 74 kilometers. So even with the quartz ceramic cone, the engagement zone did not reach the radar horizon, which is at 350 meters at such a distance. However, the development is clearly visible compared to the initial engagement zone of the system. The maximum altitude of the engagement zone is at 27,000 meters at a distance of 75 kilometers, which was limited by the allowed maximum flight altitude by the quasi-ballistic trajectory. The minimum range of the engagement zone is 5 kilometers against low altitude and terrain-following targets. Against close but high altitude targets, the scan zone of the RPM fire control radar can restrict the engagement zone. The maximum elevation of the scan and track is 70 degrees, which means 9 kilometers of horizontal distance at a 27,000 meters of altitude. Against incoming and receding targets, the system had a blind zone. The radial velocity of the target cannot less than 30 meters per second, which is 108 kilometers per hour. The guaranteed engagement zone covers the same area as the peak overload of the missile, where it is able to perform about 15 to 18 G-turns. In my opinion, this is a very conservative estimate. Although the speed and the maximum possible overload of the missile decreases with increasing distance, the missile did not leave a smoke trail. Thanks to this, it is essentially cannot be outmaneuvered because a well-executed defensive turn cannot be performed because the missile is invisible to the pilot. The chance that the fighter outmaneuvers the missile with a random high G-turn is essentially zero. It is worth comparing the engagement zone with the previous systems. The minimum engagement distance is slightly higher than the S-125M Nevas. It was 5 km instead of 3.5 km. This is probably the result of the vertical launch method and the huge missile acceleration after launch. Compared to the S-200 Vega's 17 km of minimum distance, the S-300 was a definitive improvement, and the minimum engagement altitude was not 300 meters but 25 meters. The engagement zone of the S-300P exceeded what the S-75M3 Volkov had, except the low altitude region, but this difference was true only before the introduction of the quartz ceramic cone, what solved the overheating issue. The S-300PS and PT-1 from the 90s could use the 48N6 missile of the second generation of S-300PM PMU variant. But because of the other RPN, the engagement range was only 90 km compared to the 150 km range of the PM variant. It is also worth saying a few words about the trajectories of the missile to see the progress compared to the predecessor systems. The figure shows the engagement zone of the S-300PS with 0 km flyby distance with the 5V55R missile. The figure does not consider the quartz ceramic nose cone, this is why the engagement zone is the restricted one. The figure shows the measured trajectory data, the distance, altitude and the flight time. On the second diagram at the bottom, the time-speed data of the different trajectories are shown. We can see that the 5V55R missile is much faster compared to the V600P of the Neva or the V755 missile of the Volkov. The missile following a low altitude profile reaches 25 km distance only within 25 seconds. The average ground speed is 1000 meters per second, which means the missile has even higher speed. While the average speed of the V755 missile of the Volkov against low altitude targets barely was about 600 meters per second. Compared to this, the V755 missile of the Volkov system has roughly this burnout speed only at an altitude of 20 plus kilometers, where the density of the atmosphere less than 10% compared to the sea level. Against low and medium altitude targets, the average ground speed of the 5V55R missile is even higher, about 1100 meters per second. The high missile speed is important because it reduces the time between two engagements, as the missile reaches the target quicker. In case of a miss, there is still enough time to launch again, either we are speaking about high speed and high altitude target, or even against terrain following targets arriving with a large flyby distance. The interception of short-range ballistic missiles also requires higher missile speed. It ensures that the interceptor missile reaches the interception point in time. With lower missile speed, the defended area would be considerably smaller. We can see at the upper right corner of the diagram, at 75 km of distance and 27,000 meters of altitude, speed of the missile is still about 1050 meters per second, about Mach 3. The flight altitude of the missile at this point barely decreases, while the deceleration of the missile is quite small. We can see this on the diagram at the bottom. This means that the 5V55R missile can fly far farther than what the maximum engagement zone shows. The engagement zone is restricted by the range of the RPN, the fire control radar, and the heat stress issue. The trajectory and speed profile of the 5V55 missile family were completely different from all the previous SAM systems, where the rocket engine of the missiles operated almost along the entire trajectory. However, the earlier missiles slowed down quickly after the engine burnout. They were only effective against non-maneuvering subsonic targets in their passive phases. Only the S-200 Vega deviated from this in case of very long-range engagements. The V-880 missile still accelerated above 20 km of altitude. During considerable length of the full trajectory, the rocket engine had been burnt out. No matter the very large diameter of the V-880 missile, the deceleration was relatively modest. In contrary, the 5V55 missile had a short, only about 10-second long engine operational time. The missile gained speed by only a short but a very powerful boost. The passive section of the trajectory dominates in almost every case, except short-distance engagements, since the rocket engine was burnt out following only a 10 km of flying. Despite this, the maneuverability of the 5V55 missile family surpassed all the previous SAMs of the PVO. The diagram shows the maximum overload that can be achieved by the missile. We can see at the upper right part of the engagement zone that the missile can barely maneuver despite the speed is about Mach 3. The maximum overload is low because of the very thin atmosphere. The maximum available overload is between 2 to 3 G. For this reason, the maximum engagement distance above 18 km of altitude decreases with increasing altitude because the high altitude and the thin atmosphere renders the missile almost incapable of maneuvering. The maximum G limit of the V-755 missile of the Volkhov was only 7 G. The most advanced V-759 missile could perform only a 9 G turn at the typical altitude of the tactical airplanes. The V-601P missile of the S-125 Neva had about 10 to 13 maximum G, depending on the distance, but only at low and medium altitude. The diagram shows that the 5V-55 missile family had better maneuverability against tactical planes across the engagement zone over any previous SAM system. Suppressing or destroying an S-300P missile battery means a totally different task than destroying a previous SAM system. The system is partially protected against the AGM-88 HARM anti-radar missile and similar threats because the S-300 can track and guide a missile to them. Older Neva and Volkhov SAMs had only a single target channel. The only thing that they could do was turn off their fire control radar if the anti-radiation missile was close. It had not made sense to waste a missile to shoot down an anti-radiation missile because it would have provided the same result as the anti-radiation missile missed because the radar was turned off. Even if they had downed an anti-radiation missile, they would have not been able to track any other target. This is not the case with the S-300P family. Yes, the number of free target channels is reduced if the missile battery prepares for such a threat, but this allows the continued engagement of other targets, while at the same time the incoming anti-radiation missiles could be downed. Suppression of an S-300 battery was far more difficult compared to other SAMs, and destroying was even harder. In the Homeland Air Defense role, the anti-radiation missiles were not expected, but the S-300 was prepared to handle such a threat. This is the direct consequence of the experiences of the Vietnam War. The threat of the anti-radiation missiles was a reality for Soviet cities and military installations, which were within the range of the tactical fighters and strike planes. Such area was, for example, Vladivostok, the main port of the Pacific Fleet. Moscow and other targets deep in the Soviet Union were far beyond the range of any fighter jets, and intercontinental bombers have never been fitted with anti-radiation missiles. On the other hand, this threat had to be considered in case the export of the S-300, where the appearance of anti-radiation missiles were anticipated. The self-protection capability of the missile batteries has the following limitations. The fire control radar, the RPN, has a 105 degree wide scan zone in azimuth. If the targets are incoming from two different directions, with a larger bearing difference, the RPN cannot detect and track them. No matter the RLO tracks all the targets in 360 degrees, the RPN can engage only one of them. The command unit missile battery structure had a direct effect on the anti-arm capability. In case of the S-75-125 systems, the target acquisition radar was part of the missile battery. If an anti-radiation missile was aimed at the fire control radar, the missile flew essentially directly towards the target acquisition radar either. Even if the P-12 or P-18 had shorter detection range than the RLO, they provided the detection of incoming arms and the time to turn off the fire control radars, except if they were cluttered by electronic jamming. The older target acquisition radars like the P-12 or P-18 were immune to anti-radiation missiles because of their meter operational wavelength. They used the VHF band. In the case of the S-300, if an anti-radiation missile is launched by one of the targets which is not tracked by the RPN, then the RLO radar of the command unit has to detect it. It has already been clarified that the RPN is not able to scan a large airspace quickly. However, the RLO could be up to 30 km distance from a missile battery. Therefore, if an anti-radiation missile is only about 30 km from the RPN, the distance between the airallow and the anti-radiation missile is 60 km. Based on the brochure figure of the airallow, it can detect a target with a radar cross-section of 0.1 square meters from about 107 km. Therefore, even though the missile batteries do not have a 360-degree target acquisition radar, detection of the incoming anti-radiation missiles for the entire regiment or brigade is improved compared to the other SAMs. Moreover, the detection speed of the airallow exceeded the P12, P15 and P18 radars. Contrary to the P12, P15 and P18 radars, the airallow uses decimeter wavelength, therefore it can be attacked with anti-radiation missiles. This means that the missile batteries must defend their airallow radar. This means that an S-300 regiment with only 2 active missile batteries can't provide 360-degree protection to the airallow, because 2 RPN fire control radars can only cover about 200 degrees. The NVO, the low-level target acquisition radar, can detect a missile climbing from under the radar horizon in 360 degrees, but the lofted missile spends such a short time in the low-level region that it makes the detection of an AGM-88 harm or any similar anti-radiation missile only theoretical. The S-300P MU, the export variant, does not have a command unit, see later. Because of the missing airallow, the missile battery has the 360-degree target acquisition radar, the SA-68U. It is a far inferior radar in many aspects compared to the airallow. It has shorter detection range, in addition, the target acquisition time is also longer. Considering all these factors, it can detect anti-radiation missiles from a shorter distance than the airallow, no matter that the ST-68U radar is at the missile battery and not 30 km away as the airallow would be. If 2 or more S-300 missile batteries are close to each other, in theory such a high amount of anti-radiation missiles is needed to bypass the firepower and lots of target channels of the RPN that it made the successful engagement almost impossible in the Cold War era. Simply too many planes and anti-radiation missiles needed. Planes in practice could carry only a pair of anti-radiation missiles. 6 missile batteries were manufactured as export variant of the S-300PS. In 1989, Bulgaria and the German Democratic Republic, formerly known as the East Germany, bought 1 missile batteries. In 1990, Czechoslovakia joined to the club of the S-300 owners. They also bought a single missile battery. Hungary and Poland also planned to acquire a single missile battery, but due to the political revolutions in Eastern Europe and the poor state national economics, these countries cancelled the acquisition. In 1990, following the reunification of Germany, the ex-East German missile battery was given back to the Soviet Union. Finally, in 1994, China bought 4 missile batteries for $220 million. These were the missile batteries of the ex-Warsaw Pact countries and the training battery from Russia. On the figure are the main elements of an S-300P MU missile battery. It is essentially an S-300PS, but without the command unit. Because of the financial issues, the Warsaw Pact members planned to acquire only 1 or at the best 2 missile batteries, therefore the cost of the common battery was too high to them. Instead, the airallow radar, the missile battery had its own target acquisition radar, the 36D6 RLS, or more commonly known as the ST-60U, NATO code Thin Shield radar. As usual, the missile battery can receive target coordinates via digital data link from higher levels integrated air defense systems and other radars. It is worth briefly returning the topic of the deployment time and the mobility because of the different structure of the system compared to the PS variant. It gave the opportunity for some tricks. Thanks to the modular design of the S-300, the missile battery can be split among more than one site. The deployment of the 5 YA-63 cabin, which is required for the digital data link connection, takes about an hour. The deployment of the ST-60U radar takes about 1 hour, therefore the mobility of the export S-300P MU variant was worse than the Soviet PS has. When the missile battery relocates, in the first 60 minutes the only available radar is the RPN, which has very limited target acquisition capability. Not even the digital data link connection is available for the PMU variant in the first hour. However, by splitting the missile battery in two, the equipment of the battery can be deployed at two different locations. The 5EL62 antenna system, which ensures the digital data link connection, can be prepared at the first site, meanwhile the NVO radar can be deployed at the second site. Both sites can have two launcher sections, each with 3 launchers, in total each with 24 missiles. In this case, only the RPN radar would have relocated between the two pre-prepared sites. With this method, it was possible to have a 5-minute readiness time in both pre-prepared places, but the places had to be set up ahead in time. While the RPN was deployed and wasn't in operation at one site, the another can be relocated. But the price of this partial flexibility, that if the data link connection is available at one site, and the RLS has to be at the another. This does not provide the same level of situational awareness. If only the data link is available, then only target coordinates are forwarded to the PMU missile battery, and the quality of the data supply depends on the target acquisition radars in the data link system. In case the data link connection is missing by any factor, and only the NVO radar is available, then the S-300 PMU would nearly be incapable of a real medium high-level engagement because of the lack of situational awareness. At the second site, the low-level capability is restricted because the missing NVO radar. The RPN radar can only perform a 105-degree wide sector search, but at least at the second site has the RLS, the medium high-level target search is solved by this. For the Soviet PS variant, the digital data link connection was provided by the PBU of the command unit, so it was available within 5 minutes following the starting of the deployment. This was a feature which lagged the PMU variant. The S-300 system is modular. This makes possible to install the RPN and the ST-68UM radars on a 40V6M mast by sacrificing mobility, which increases the deployment time of the system into scale of 1 hour. This is true not only for the PMU, but for the all variants. One last thing about the export of the S-300. There was another variant designed for export. It would have been a simplified and cheaper variant of the S-300PT. It was called ORSA. The goal was to make the widest possible utilization of the existing infrastructure of the S-75 and Volkov in the Warsaw Pact and the Third World countries. These items were the hardened shelters, diesel aggregators, target acquisition radar, and the deployment areas on the sites. The new system would have only 3 target channels and 6 missile channels, only half of the S-300PT. It would have had only radio command guided 5E55K missile with 47 km of range. Only the member states of the Warsaw Pact would have received the NVO, the low altitude target acquisition radar. The export variant to the Third World countries would have lacked this radar. A single ORSA missile battery would have only 3 TOW launchers with 12 missiles. However, the ORSA variant was cancelled in 1982. In the military operation launched by Russia against Ukraine in February of 2022, the S-300P family participated in combat operations on both sides. The S-300PT and PS missile batteries, which were inherited after the collapse of the Soviet Union, were used extensively by Ukraine. In total, 41 S-300PS and S-300PT-1 missile batteries were in their inventory in the early 90s. During the Russian occupation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, 8 missile batteries fell into Russian hands. Between 2003 and 2021, several batteries were utilized as spare parts, so at the end of 2021, only 22 missile batteries were combat capable. The presence of the Ukrainian S-300P batteries, as well as the Russian S-300 systems, significantly limited the air operations on both sides. The Ukrainian conflict proved the concept of the multi-target channel capable area denial SAMs. The presence of this kind of area denial SAMs essentially restricted the non-stealth aircraft to a terrain-following mission profile. At the beginning of the war, both sides tried operating at medium and high altitudes, but they quickly abandoned this because of the losses. The fact that the Ukrainian plane was shot down over Kyiv was a good example of the area denial capabilities of these systems. The planes were not safe flying even in their own airspace. On the other hand, short-range infrared guided SAMs and even air defense guns were used against aircraft operating at low altitudes. At the beginning of the war, the Ukrainians shot down dozens of Russian planes with them. Even the most advanced Su-34 Strike and Su-35 multi-role fighter jets were among the victims. Because of this, air operations were reduced to a minimum for a time. For this reason, the possible use of non-stealth aircraft in strike mission is essentially limited to launch of long-range cruise missiles or performing precision bomb and gliding bomb lofting from a terrain-following flight. The bomb lofting method had been presented in a previous video about the F-16s and Ukraine. The S-300P also performed exceptionally well against drones and terrain-following cruise missiles. However, despite the presented capabilities, the S-300P family is not a wonder weapon either. It clearly shows that several S-400 missile batteries were eliminated on the Russian side, and countless of the much more modestly capable systems on the Ukrainian side were also lost. Part of the reason of these losses that they need to stand up in a completely different environment than what they were originally designed for. Due to the losses and the depletion of missile stocks, Slovakia handed over its only S-300P MU missile battery to Ukraine. Apart from that, only Bulgaria has one PMU missile battery in Europe. Apart these, Greece has some S-300P MU-1 and Turkey some S-400E missile batteries, but so far none of them were transferred to Ukraine. In parallel with the production of the S-300P MU variant, the second S-300 generation, the S-300PM, also began, but this and later variants are not presented here, they are a topic for another time. If you like the video, you can share, like, subscribe or ring the bell and follow the channel. You can support it via Patreon for exchange for early access, voting on planned topics and extra content and updates about the project. So far, 10 Patreon extra content has been released, their descriptions are in the link under the video.